You may not realize it, but for decades, Adam Moss influenced where you ate, what you bought, how you should behave, where you should send your child to school, and how you think about the world. He was editor of the New York Times Magazine and then editor in chief of New York Magazine for 15 years until he retired in 2019. He transformed magazine coverage and then the notion of a magazine when he embraced the web and added digital sites like The Cut and Grub Street to the New York Magazine imprint. He chalked up dozens of awards and accolades, and he could have left it at that. But in retirement, he utterly humbled himself by becoming an artist, a painter. After a lifetime of achievement, he chose to struggle. He began wondering, how does anybody make art? From that frustration came his first book, The Work of Art, a beautifully done inquiry into the essential question of creativity. How do you make something out of nothing? I am delighted to welcome Adam Moss to At Lunch. Welcome, Adam.
Hi, Julie.
Hi. See, I promised you something out of nothing.
There you do. It's amazing. And then I just popped up.
And then you just popped up. So before we talk about your wonderful book, I was thinking this morning that I did have to ask you, has this political moment we are in make you wish that you were back in the editor's seat at all?
Well, I'm a mixed mind about that. On the one hand, yes, dramatic change is, it's really interesting for journalists, and there's just a lot to chew on right now, and it would be interesting to be a journalist. On the other hand, as a like person, uh, I have found myself doing what I know a lot of other people have done, which is that I just simply, for the first time, really since I was a kid, I just flipped it all off, and I stopped paying attention, and I just pretended that this was all happening in some other world on television someplace. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I was still a journalist. But I also feel like that's an irresponsible way to be a human being. And so and I was so jolted by yesterday or 2 days ago, that it kind of woke me up. And so now I'm actually back engaged, and yeah, it would be kind of interesting to be making journalism out of it. But it's fine. Let someone else do that. There's a lot
Well,
of good.
I'm glad to hear that's what you've been doing because, like so many others, me too, and feeling a little guilty. And yes, I'm
Yeah.
starting to get back into it, but trying to balance. And part of that balance is having books like this to help me think about other things. And so, look, I think a lot of people think, well, what happens when I leave one job and then go to another, which is what I think you actually kind of did. Could you sort of tell people the origin story of the book? What made you write it? And I know I said it was because you were trying to paint and,
Well,
you know,
that's the answer in a way. I
yeah,
mean,
but I mean,
that was
what is
not
that?
wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically so I was kind of winding down my magazine life and feeling like I had done all I could do with the New York job, and that I had kind of aged out of the job, that the readers were much younger than me. The staff was much younger than me. I just felt like it was time for somebody else to do it. And but I didn't know kind of what I wanted to do. And I felt like I was like racing so hard in my other job that I felt like I wasn't able to figure that out until I actually left the job. So I kind of left the job with a kind of giant question mark. Um, and the one thing I knew that I wanted to do was paint. I had started painting about a year earlier, just as a hobby. I mean, not even as a hobby, just as a kind of like dumb thing that I would do in the morning before I would go to work, because I just like feeling my hand making stuff. There was just a physical sensation in it, like someone else would go to the gym or something. And I'd always been interested in the visual part of magazine making. Visual storytelling was particularly appealing to me. So And I also, one more thing. So I also have a house in Provincetown in Cape Cod that used to be a painting school. So there's a kind of like, uh, ghosts of painters past thing that comes into this. So I kind of, but I never had any training whatsoever. And it was super fun because I was just doing it as a complete lark. And then I quit my job and then I started to paint. And I had the unfortunate circumstance, a lot of people have this, that out of the gate, I actually wasn't a bad painter. And I had a lot of kind of beginner good instincts. Then I started to educate myself a little bit, and I started to put the pressure on myself to, well, maybe I can actually be a real artist. Maybe I can be a real painter. I was completely deluded, and it was full of this fantasy. But the fantasy was meeting up against the reality of my painting, which got seriously worse as I got more and more invested in it. So this frustrated me to no end. And I began to think that there was something I just wasn't understanding, particularly in the way that my whole career had been in groups, and where there's a kind of, well, what comes up in the book is something called the bounce, where creativity happens as a sort of consequence of different people playing off each other, bouncing, like if you think of the physics of a moving ball. And making art, some kinds of art, the kind of art I was trying to make, is a solo activity. There's no one to bounce off of. You bounce off of yourself. I didn't know how to do that. So I started to think I need a book that will give me entrance into an artist's mind. I looked for it, I couldn't find it. And then I thought, in spite of everything I'd ever told myself, I'm going to have to write this book myself. So I started to think about what kind of book it would be. And then I have always been extremely interested in artifacts of making, sketches and studies and notes and outlines and doodles. And I thought, well, what if I go find any number of artists of all kinds, be very liberal about what I call an artist, and talk to them about the making of one thing and center that around the artifacts of the making of the thing, that would be truthful. I could actually sort of put them on the couch and honestly reconstruct how they made this thing, both practically and also what was in their mind as they were doing it. And I started to do that, and that became the book. As a way to help me understand why it is I couldn't paint, and then the larger just question of how do artists think. That's kind of what the book was about. That's a really long answer to your question. I
No,
promise
it's a great.
I will not do that again.
No, you absolutely can do. We have time, but I want to. What do they say? Put a pin on that because I want to follow up on those artists that you chose.
Mhm.
But before that, you said that um, you thought you could make it as a painter. So here's the question. So what would that have meant to you? Did you want to be like in MoMA, or did you want to, I mean, was that a fantasy, or did you want to be, I mean, what would that mean to you to be successful as a painter?
That's a really good question. And it was not to be in MoMA. It wasn't even to be in a dumb show somewhere, a little show. It was really just to make paintings I liked, and also paintings that I was proud enough to show other people,
Uh-huh.
and that might result in me forming an identity where I could justify in my own head being an artist full time.
Yeah,
Um,
that's great. Well, and I asked that for a reason because I think for a lot of people, when they retire from their jobs and they start doing something, whether
yeah,
it's, I think that, when you have a job, you have to do a good job or you'll be fired. You won't get money
yes,
anymore.
yes,
Then when you start doing it, I guess as a hobby, but hobby sounds so unserious in a way,
yes,
right?
right,
So how do you
exactly.
find that? Yeah, so that's, yeah. So I
But
understand
really,
that. So
I started to I found when I was doing this book that a lot of people's origin stories centered around the question of when they would call them then when they allowed themselves to call themselves a painter or a writer or a songwriter. And I kind of didn't understand that, but then I actually now think that's the answer to your question. Could I call myself a painter and not be embarrassed?
And not be embarrassed. Yeah, that's a good
Yeah.
answer. See, we're
Uh-huh.
going to talk about being Jewish later, but I think that's already the first thing.
We're baking the pie right now.
We're making- So I love the choice of artists in this book, the work of art, because, some people seem pretty obvious, oh, Stephen Sondheim, I think he's an artist, or Tony
Yeah.
Kushner or Carol Walker, people like that. But, Will Shortz, the crossword puzzles, and then people I'd never heard of, were
Yeah.
chefs or whatever. So was that a deliberate strategy right from the get-go of having this broad range of people? Or like, how did you even pick? I mean, look, you sort of went back, I suppose, at some level to being a great magazine editor because you had to figure out what the components are of this.
Yeah, I mean, basically that is the answer, is that I, tried to think what would make the most interesting book. And I began to feel, I mean, I feel even now, a year after writing the book or more, um, that the same kind of inquiry could be applied productively to a physicist or people out of the purview of the book. But I did feel like I had to have a boundary somewhere. And I made it kind of loose. I started with the core. I started with the people you mentioned. I mean, literally the first people I talked to were Kara Walker and Stephen Sondheim. Oh, and Michael Cunningham, who I did a kind of test run of the whole book with, because he's my friend and I knew he would indulge me that. Um, and and then as I started to do it, I began to be curious about different paths. Would cooking, the making of a food, have the same elements as the making of a painting? Would the writing of a joke, have the same essential makeup, as the writing of a novel that takes you 10 years to write? And and then at one point it was just and then I was like a little bit opportunistic. I was having lunch, for example, with a very talented friend of mine named Ian Adelman, who was the sort of graphic genius behind all the digital imperialism of the New York Magazine world, and he showed me a sandcastle that he had built, and it was this really, because he's a very driven and a talented guy. There was kind of an obsessive, crazy sandcastle, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sandcastle, and I began to think, well, wouldn't it be interesting to have a piece of art that is meant to perish at the end of the day? So I just kept following these little leads. I had a figurative artist, be sort of interesting to test this against a abstract artist. And then, well, I had an abstract artist, it'd be sort of interesting to test it against a generative artist who would make their art through a computer. So it was curiosity, I'd say, was the essential driving force.
Interesting. So, you've always been identified before this as an editor, and I've heard you in other interviews talk about your obsession with comic books, Mad Magazine, and then new
Hmm.
journalism, which, hit a lot of, rang a lot of bells with me. And,
Sure.
that particular obsession could lead to somebody writing. That's what it did for me. And yet, it didn't for you. You became an editor. And yet this book that we're talking about is the work of Adam Moss, the writer. And you actually are quite a beautiful writer, I have to
Oh,
say.
you're very nice.
Well, no, I'm not. I'm actually not that nice sometimes, but I am accurate, I think. And I
That has
wondered if
been my experience of you reading you.
and so I guess my question is, had you always had a secret hankering to be a writer, which is kind of a miserable thing to do in a lot of ways? Or how did you decide at it? Because you were so young when you decided to be when you became an editor. I don't know if you decided to or you just became it, but had you ever wanted to be a writer?
Yeah, sure. I mean, nobody in this day and age, it's a little different. In my day, nobody wanted to be an editor. Nobody even knew what an editor was. People still don't know what an editor is, but it just wasn't a career aspiration. So I started in magazines back when I was, just graduating college, even before that. And I, made an effort at being a writer, a freelance writer, and I couldn't stand it. I found the being alone in the room thing to be almost literally maddening. I mean, I really would just go kind of go a little nuts sitting in that chair having to make something. Whereas I found that when I would go to the day part of my job, because I had like baby editor kind of assignments, I would really just love it. I would love sitting in a room and hashing it out with my colleagues and together making something. It was much more like kindergarten, where you're like at a table together and together you have the construction paper, the glue, and the scissors, and you can make some thing. It just gave me more joy. And so I started to want to do more and more of that. And then I had a kind of, I suppose, unusual career path in that I was an editor without ever being a writer. Most people are a writer first and then for whatever reason later become editors. And but for me, I was kind of a professional editor from the beginning. That's what that's just what turned me on. And I really didn't like writing. And as I got to be a better editor, I became a more, one of the things as an editor that happens is that your judgment is what your judgment, your taste, your sort of ability to observe is that's what you get paid for. So you refine it. And if you turn it on your own stuff, it's deadly. And I did. I was just deeply critical of my own writing. And in fact, this book. So as I said before in my endless introduction, um, I uh, I didn't want to write the book. I didn't ever want to write a book. It was just not part of my plan for myself. Um, but I wrote it because I wanted to read it. It's true, and uh, and I wrote it more or less twice. So the first time I wrote it in this kind of fake writer voice, that I felt was the appropriate voice for a book. It's what a book ought to sound like. And my editor self would just read this and just roll my eyes, and it was just there was a kind of ornamentation to it that was just false. So I finally realized that, and my editor self was finally able to convince my writer self to throw the whole thing out and start all over again. And then I, rewrote I finally figured out what the voice was, and I rewrote the book as myself. And I wasn't happy with it, but I was happier with it, and I was able to, you know, let other people see it.
And they'll be happy with it
Yes,
because
I hope
it's very good. That no, it's great.
so.
So, as I warned you before we began,
Hmm.
um, we are going to talk a little about your background, but I wanted to just read a very brief paragraph from an article that I think somebody wrote when in the New York Times when you retired from New York Magazine, and they said this about your background. He was born in Brooklyn and grew up in Hewlett, New York, a town he called Goodbye Columbus, Nouveau Riche. His mother, a psychologist, tested Rorschach ink blots on Mr. Moss and his brother. The blots are now framed on the wall of the editor's kitchen. Did that have an effect? Oh my God, yes, Mr. Moss said, laughing, but we won't go into all of that. But could we go into a little bit of this? This is the American Jewish Historical Society, and we'd like to know what made people become what they became and how much of that, I don't know, is attributed to your Jewish and can be, as you said, emphasis on the ish, but what part did being Jewish play in your identity? And, I mean, look, I'm not putting you on the couch here. We don't have
No,
that
no,
much.
no.
But how did it affect you positively and negatively and, as a person and in your career, do you think?
Yeah. So, it obviously affected me enormously, the ish part anyway. I'm actually, even though I did have a bar mitzvah, I have almost no religious education. Basically, the storyline in my family was that I had a very religious set of grandparents on my mother's side. My mother was a kind of bratty bohemian rebel type who rejected her parents' religiousness, and then brought a agnostic religious thing to the home, but carried with her an enormous amount of Jewish cultural baggage, which, I grew up saturated in. And I grew up, Hewlett, Long Island, is a town that when I was growing up there, and I think it's still the case, although different kind of Jew, was, kind of everybody was Jewish. It was, I mean, honestly, I think about 90% of my classmates were Jewish. So I kind of never met a non-Jew until I went to college. And so my worldview, which was very, but it's a certain kind of Jewishness, it's like it was smart-ass Jewishness. It was like cynical and questioning and a deep, deep, deep investment in education and intelligence is a very high standard. That's what you didn't aspire to be a jock. You aspired to be smart, and maybe you aspired even to be a little smart ass. That was the kind of value of the family and of my parents' friends. So when I started to read as a kid, I started to read New York Magazine, as my parents were charter subscribers, and Mad Magazine and Esquire in the 60s. These are all things that probably, Julie, you can, if you responded to the checked boxes, you'll respond to these. They had a kind of, they were sort of born of the 60s, but they were also born of a kind of Jewish sensibility, even if their makers weren't all Jewish. There was a kind of sardonic point of view that media in that period shared that felt kind of Jewish. And I always associate it as being Jewish. So I don't know. It's a little hard to pick apart what influenced you, but because I, was uh, brought up in such a kind of Jewish hothouse, really. Um, I have to assume that a lot of the way I look at the world is Jewish.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, yes, like I said, I read a lot of those things, but I grew up in a small town in Southern Ohio where I was the Jew. We were the only ones. But
Yeah.
I also gravitated toward those same, that was sort of an education, really, and some
Yeah.
kind of Jewish sensibility, whatever it was.
Yeah.
I was only 80 miles from Columbus, where I guess Goodbye Columbus was somehow related to that. Yeah, that's really
I
interesting.
mean, if you think about the early days of New York Magazine, I mean, Clay Felker is just a famous goy, who he invented New York Magazine. Couldn't have gotten more goyish in a sense, and he invented it with Milton Glaser, a Jew. But if you look at the early issues of the magazine, they're just so, I think, unmistakably Jewish. There was a kind of primacy in that era of a Jewish sensibility that is really conspicuous, especially in retrospect.
But do you think it exists now?
Well, it's more, I think it has its place now, but we're in a world where many different sensibilities are competing, um, because nobody kind of owns the means of production anymore. And
So far.
so far, well, I mean, they do own it, but the way the thing works is that there's not, there's not a guardian, and a sensibility guardian. You find your people. In the time we're talking about, there very much were gatekeepers who created the sensibility of the time.
Yeah, well, maybe this is sort of a related question or the same question. I'm not sure, but I have been thinking about the zeitgeist. I mean, if I thought about New York Magazine throughout years of reading it, it's like it defined the zeitgeist, certainly
Yeah.
of not just New York, though, but people who had an idea of New York, I guess.
Yeah, or sophistication, or
Yeah.
a kind of urban perspective. And it was the way the media in general. I mean, it was the early days of New York. It was very much the same across the board. There was a specific, and somewhat warped, completely ironic, um, sensibility, zeitgeist that ruled uh, the time. I mean, it
And
was a fabulous time to be an adolescent, kind of uh, marinating in it, because it was a kind of adolescent sensibility.
Yeah, and I think it was an adolescence that lasted a very long time for a lot
Yes.
of us.
Yes.
Um, but I mean, do you think there isn't, can we even talk about it as zeitgeist anymore? Do you think such a thing can even be said to exist today?
It's harder. You could tease things out. If you were a magazine editor, for instance, at the and it was your obligation to try to, tie threads together as kind of that's the job description, even though magazines themselves have changed so much. Um, you could. But
Yeah,
but it's harder. Yeah, there's not as much of a dominant there's not a funnel. There's not a culture funnel that says this is what's interesting. You pick it.
yeah, interesting. So somebody had posted this question earlier when you were talking about rewriting your book and finding your voice. How did you recognize it? How did you know what your writer's voice was? What made you see what were you seeing or hearing or whatever to make you think that's my voice?
Um, that's a hard thing to describe, but it's really, I have an editor's eye. So I kind of, and I have, I like to think I have taste. So, so my taste was saying yuck to my first version, and my taste was saying, okay. There was a sound to it that persuaded me. I have that ability to be both myself and a reader at the same time. I guess that's kind of what I learned how to do. And yeah, I kind of said, okay, a reader won't barf reading these sentences and with these ideas. And I also like the more I wrote the book, the more I understood how it worked as a whole. I wrote the book in parts. The book is it's 43 different chapters. Each chapter is quite different from one another.
Mhm.
That was part of my ambition to write a book that didn't feel like other books. And I kind of was, as someone who worked in magazines for so long, I kind of was interested in bending the book form and trying different things with it. So one of the things I tried to do with it was uh, to use different storytelling methods in every chapter, and I was constantly on the lookout. Is this just annoying? Does it feel precious, or does it actually contribute to the theme of the book, which is a kind of creative expression? And I satisfied myself that it did the latter. And then, then the book had other elements um, that were very deliberate and that I was playing with and that I wasn't sure were going to work until I saw the whole thing. If you read the book it's almost diagrammatic. There are arrows um, bringing you into the text as a kind of way in which the text and the images are meant to talk to each other in a more deliberate way than you're used to in a book. I wasn't sure whether that would work. I wasn't sure whether the footnotes are actually not an afterthought. They're actually part of the storytelling. They're a storytelling layer of the book. All of that was just like, huh? Is this gonna all come together? So I was on the alert in all ways for, is this book working or not?
So, it's interesting. I was thinking that you were saying really earlier on that you didn't want to be a writer because you hated being alone in a room. You like to bounce ideas off as your book is a bouncy book. There's a lot of ideas
Yeah.
bouncing around in it. But you also once said that you're super bad at small talk. So we must be having great depth talk here because you're very good at it. But if you don't like small talk to do this book, you had to interview a lot of people for a long time. And I know some of them were friends, but a lot of them weren't. Did you enjoy that process of interviewing the people? And then have you enjoyed the other part of the interview process where you're the one being interviewed because you've been going around
Oh, I see.
promoting the book?
I very much enjoyed talking to the people in the book. That was the best part of the whole thing. I mean, I I said that I didn't want to write a book, but I did construct a book where I would yoke partners and make them make the book with me. So I would kind of recreate a little bit of the satisfaction of what I had in my magazine life. So, I met all these people, and the conversations were not small talk. They quickly got quite serious. And I did the book during COVID, so I think that that really helped it
Mm.
in the sense that people were more introspective. And also there's a kind of self-selection process. The only people who would do this book with me were people who were actually interested in the questions I was asking. A lot of people rejected it for all sorts of superstitious reasons. They felt that they didn't want to try to understand how they made what they made. It would, as I say in the book, jinx the muse. And so it was a kind of self-selected population of people who are actually, they themselves didn't know how they made what they made. They were just as curious as I was, and they were willing to submit themselves to an interrogation that we would both do together to try to figure this thing out. And some of them were like, some of them I saw over months and months and months. Some of them were shorter, but they all got pretty deep. And that was important. And then came the writing part where I was by myself, and that I didn't like, as I have basically laid out for you. Then came another phase that I liked again, which was the putting the book together and trying to create a physical book that seemed interesting to me. And for that, I went to my old colleague Luke Heyman at Pentagram, and his team, his group of people who make things, um, and you know, and said, "Can I come over and can we play together?" And so there was several months where that was the job. The job was like making a book. Let's make a book together. So really, very little of it was just me alone in a room. I had kind of
Mhm,
did
mhm.
it in a way that was not that I avoided that.
And what about the part two part having
Oh, the part two, talking about it.
to?
Well, my God, it depends. I mean, it's like I don't like talking about myself at all. I am talking about myself. Here I am. But you're asking me, so I don't know. I mean, it's like it. I would say that I didn't like it at all at the beginning, and now I'm kind of more used to it. What I really like is actual conversations with people who have read the book. That's my favorite part. I do get notes from people, or I am in you know, some kind of reading presentation thing, and some people at this stage have read the book and want me to sign it, saying, and come to the table, and we actually have a talk about it, and they tell me about how they are trying to make something, or they are just curious about X person and Y person, or they are just uh, in, interested generally in the subject, or they're a scholar, or they're a poet, or whatever, wherever they have come from. Um, I love that. My favorite part, the feedback part.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah.
So, so what do you think is the hardest? To be a writer, a magazine editor, or a painter? And why?
Oh my God, what a question. Well, I think they're all hard. I think one of the things I learned in this book was, I came in with a very romantic idea of what making anything was about. I thought you'd just be like a sort of 2-year-old where you can splatter some paint on a canvas and call it a day and say, "Look at this amazing thing I made."
It's
And
so cute that you thought that.
yes, I'm 67 years old, and I thought that.
Forever young. I love it.
I mean, more or less, I thought that, but I certainly thought you could get yourself into a place where that would be the case. But
Mhm.
and certainly there's a place you get to where you kind of do suspend your intellect, or your strategizing, and something else takes over. It's a very satisfying part of art making, no matter what you're doing. But for the most part, it is extremely hard work. So I think uh, it helps. I mean, it's not just helps, it's absolutely necessary to be, whether you're a painter or a writer or a magazine editor, to be kind of almost single-mindedly interested in the task at hand. If you're not, if you don't have that kind of consuming interest, you will actually have more trouble with it. You will fail at it. It's too difficult. And what gets you through the difficulty is a, a kind of dog with a bone, relentless, obsessive um, drive.
Yeah.
But no, there's nothing more. There's nothing harder about one thing than another. I don't think it's just who you are and whether you're suited to the thing at hand.
Yeah, I was curious, that's so interesting when you talk about people responding to the book. I mean, for me personally, just reading about, Tony Kushner, his crazy feelings of lack of self-worth
Oh,
in the
I
Trump
know.
project
Yeah.
and all that. Like it's completely insane, but you're thinking, but it also is incredibly familiar. And so I
Yeah,
think part of it for anybody who does anything, just to see that people who are at the very, very, very top of their game have the same mishigas that, anybody has.
absolutely. And in fact, the book is really about failure.
Yeah.
It's one failure after another, and yeah, they all have that incredible sense of doubt and sense of feeling that they're not good enough and they can't make the thing. But they also have the flip side of that, which is they have an incredible ability to get up from the failure, to not let the failure actually defeat them. So while Tony Kushner, say, could over and over and over again beat himself up for what he was unable to do, he also had the, you know, incredible and unusual ability to get up the next morning and say, no, I'm going to figure this out, or it's not even a decision, it's a kind of need um, to do this. And what the Michael Cunningham chapter is really all about, all of the things the hours um, could have been, were at one time, before it was a story of three women, including Virginia Woolf, who wasn't there for any number of the first drafts. We associate the hours entirely. I mean, Nicole Kidman won an Academy Award for it. We associate the book with, um, with Virginia Woolf. But he tried a million different things. Every one of them failed. Every one of them felt like just terrible to him, and he didn't give up the book. George Saunders tried a million times to write Lincoln in the Bardo, just this absolutely amazing book that he did end up writing, and he persevered. And that perseverance is like perseverance through failure is just bam, 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 bam. It's the story of everything, which I find as a wannabe painter and also just as a person who loves culture to be incredibly interesting and also reassuring. Um, and when something comes easily, almost all of these people are suspicious of it. Um, that's not the way it goes. It does sometimes, but it's not really the way it goes. And it only goes that way if someone's had a lifetime of acquiring skills and experience. Um,
Yeah. And maybe the best skill is the skill to know that it may seem like you're failing, but you're not
yes,
actually.
yes.
So I can't believe we're getting a warning that we have to wrap up. And I have many other things I want to discuss with you, but so we'll do some rapid rounds. No, I'm kidding, but not really. So the book's gotten really unbelievable response. You've gotten terrific reviews, bestseller list, all that. Has that made you want to write another book, or does it make you want to quit while you're ahead?
The latter. I mean, I might write another book, but no, I can't believe my luck. It's first time around. And and also, yeah, I mean, it was just interesting. I kind of if I have another book that I think I can do and do well, I'll do it. But I don't have that drive itself to write another book. No.
Yeah, I love that you say luck. That's always That's always something my mother always has said, "Oh, you're so lucky." And you think, well, it's not that hard work and all that, but I think it's so important to know how important that is too,
Oh
right?
yeah, I'm a big believer in luck. I mean, you have to make your own luck, blah blah blah.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
but luck
right.
is still in there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, how about your painting? Are you still painting and has it gotten better?
I am still painting. It has not gotten better, but I love it more. And
Oh,
the reason I love it more is, I mean, one of the things that Julie, you're a journalist, you're a storyteller. You're trying to find a narrative, and the narrative you want would have a kind of conclusion. And I kept wanting the conclusion to be cathartic, and I kept wanting people to say, "Hey, I finished this thing and I was ecstatic and I was jubilant, and it was the culmination of all I wanted. I wanted that happy ending so badly, and no one gave it to me. No one at all." And and I just kept saying, so, yeah, people would say, yeah. I was glad, yeah, I kind of liked what I did, and I was glad it was over. I felt relief. And the next day they started the next thing, and what they would say to me over and over again. This is like the last few sentences of the book, but it's really true. Um, is it's the work that's interesting. It's not the thing you're making, it's the making. So I did begin to apply that to my own painting. And now I'm just very happy when I make a single mark that's beautiful to me, or that's interesting to me. I'm happy being consumed in the process of making something, and I don't have to love what I'm making. Um, but I love going to a studio and painting.
that's really wonderful. And I know, just as a final word, there were a lot of questions I wanted to ask you about journalism today and blah blah, but this was more interesting. But I think what it makes me think as a final thought is, I know for me, having a book like this, having books, having anything in my life that's not directly related to politics is really helpful. But I also don't want to, like you said at the very beginning, escape from it. And
Hmm.
so I think, what do we take from the artists in our culture and the people who make things and apply it to what we want for our world, now? Like,
Yeah.
how do you find that balance between not completely shutting the door on what's going on out there, but using what you explore so beautifully here in terms of thinking about that?
Yeah, I don't, is that a question? Because I don't know the answer.
Question.
Um,
I thought you
uh,
might. You think there's no answer?
I mean, I do think you just feel your way through it. I think, art is a solace, and art it's even an answer to what life is about in a sense. Um, but you have to stay engaged. I mean, if you're a reasonable citizen, you have to stay engaged in the way in which we all relate to one another. And um, that has a lot to do with the things the news is consumed with. That has a lot to do with politics. That has a lot to do with structures, institutions, that are meant to have us help each other, or finding ways for us to coexist on the planet. Um, so I don't think you can responsibly abstain from that and just think about, you know, magenta. But I think but magenta's part of it, Magenta is a part of life too. So I just think, yeah, you have to find some kind of balance. That's part of being human.
Adam, thank you so much. This has been just a lovely conversation. I think people have really been liking it. I certainly have, which is all that really matters. So